In a tall, nondescript Pentagon building just across the Potomac River, a document was passed across a polished desk. It was stamped Top Secret, Special Handling. Inside were not battlefield strategies or defensive postures, but a detailed plan to stage violent attacks on American citizens. The purpose? To manipulate public opinion and manufacture justification for war against Fidel Castro's Cuba. It was March 1962. Just 4 months earlier, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion had humiliated the United States and emboldened Castro. President John F. Kennedy had made it clear, no direct military invasion of Cuba without overwhelming necessity. But inside the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, led by General Lyman L. Lemnitzer, were not ready to accept diplomatic restraint. Operation Northwoods proposed exactly this: false flag terrorism conducted against Americans and U.S. assets, blamed on Cuba, to justify military intervention. The document listed potential staged actions: hijacking of civil aircraft, harassment of civilian shipping, explosions at U.S. bases. Casualty lists would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. That exact phrase is written in the declassified text. Planned operations included staging the death of astronauts, sinking boats filled with Cuban refugees, and even creating a false Cuban terror campaign in U.S. cities like Miami and Washington. Another plan involved simulating the destruction of a U.S. military drone plane and fabricating evidence that a Cuban fighter jet did it. In essence, the military would deceive the world into believing Americans were being killed. It was a bold proposal, but more chilling was this: we could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. Operation Northwoods document, declassified in 1997. General Lemnitzer strongly believed it was necessary to take aggressive action to remove Castro before Cuba aligned further with the Soviet Union. Tensions were high, the Cold War was at its peak, but what was being suggested crossed into psychological warfare against U.S. citizens. And it made it all the way to the Secretary of Defense's office. The plan was never approved, but its existence proves how far strategic thinking could extend in Cold War urgency. As the paper left Pentagon hands and headed toward the White House, one question hung silently in the air. Would the President of the United States authorize an attack on his own people to start a war? The answer to that question would determine not only the fate of Operation Northwoods, but the course of world history. And someone inside the White House was about to say no. But that no would trigger even more dangerous consequences. On March 16, 1962, just 3 days after the proposal was finalized, Operation Northwoods reached the desk of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. McNamara was a strategist, known for his analytical mind and loyalty to President John F. Kennedy. He read the proposal page by page. The technical details were solid, the plan militarily feasible. But the ethical implications were staggering. Hijackings, bombings, innocent American casualties, all staged by the U.S. military and blamed on Cuba. McNamara refused. Shortly afterward, the proposal reached the president. Kennedy, already distrustful of the Joint Chiefs after the Bay of Pigs disaster in April 1961, was shocked. He directly rejected any suggestion of engaging in false flag operations. Kennedy reportedly walked out of the meeting, visibly frustrated. His decision initiated a quiet clash at the highest levels of U.S. command. Behind closed doors, tension in the Pentagon. General Lyman Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was dissatisfied. He sincerely believed the U.S. needed to remove Castro before Cuba became a fully weaponized Soviet outpost. From his perspective, diplomatic hesitation risked national security. In his eyes, Northwoods was not an evil plan. It was a necessary strategic deception in the Cold War, similar to tactics used during wartime against enemies. The difference? This one targeted U.S. citizens. Despite Kennedy's rejection, some senior officials still competed to push for aggressive action. While Kennedy emphasized caution, military leadership increasingly saw him as too soft toward communism. Conversations began, quietly, about whether the president understood the threat. But Kennedy stood firm. In September 1962, he dismissed Lemnitzer from his position as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Lemnitzer was replaced by General Maxwell Taylor, who aligned more closely with Kennedy's strategic thinking. Lemnitzer was reassigned to Europe as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. But that was not the end of Northwoods. Buried, but not forgotten. Though rejected, Operation Northwoods remained filed deep within classified Pentagon archives, unknown to the public, unread by Congress, untouched by historians. It would stay hidden for 35 years. Then came 1997. The U.S. government passed the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act, requiring the release of previously sealed documents related to Kennedy. When researchers accessed the files, what they found shocked the world. The plan the U.S. military proposed, the idea of staging terror attacks against its own people, was suddenly public. Multiple major news outlets, including ABC News, reported on it. ABC described the proposals as a series of false flag operations designed to create the appearance of Cuban hostility. The public reaction was explosive. But in 1962, during the height of the Cold War, only a few people knew. One of them was the president, and his refusal may have averted a war. Yet something else was at play. The decision not to pursue Northwoods didn't end the debate on what to do about Cuba. Instead, the military began exploring other ways. And as the Cold War intensified, the stakes would rise even higher. 8 months after Kennedy dismissed Lemnitzer from the Joint Chiefs, the crisis reached its most dangerous point. October 1962, Cuba, once again, was at the center of world attention. But this time, it wasn't about proposed fake attacks. It was about real missiles. Nuclear missiles. Soviet missiles. In Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Operation Northwoods was never implemented. But the fear that fueled its creation was about to become reality. 8 months after Operation Northwoods was rejected, the threat the Pentagon feared became real. On October 14, 1962, a CIA U-2 spy plane flew over western Cuba. High-resolution photographs revealed construction sites with Soviet R-12 nuclear missiles, capable of striking nearly every major city in the eastern United States, including Washington, D.C., New York, and Chicago. The CIA delivered the photographs to President John F. Kennedy the next day. Kennedy remained silent, staring at the images. These weren't hypothetical threats on paper. This was real. Nuclear war was now a possibility. Inside the White House Situation Room, an emergency meeting was held. Present were McNamara, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, and senior generals. The CIA assessed that the missiles could become operational within 2 weeks. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, led partly by those who had supported Northwoods, pushed for immediate military action. Airstrikes. Invasion. Full-scale attack on Cuba. Kennedy hesitated. He knew an invasion could trigger a direct Soviet response, likely in Berlin, a city already divided between NATO and the USSR. A miscalculation could mean World War III. Instead, Kennedy ordered a naval quarantine of Cuba, not officially called a blockade, as that would be considered an act of war. U.S. Navy vessels surrounded Cuba, stopping any ship suspected of carrying missile components. Tension escalated hour by hour. On October 24th, a Soviet ship approached the naval blockade. U.S. warships were ordered to prepare for engagement. At the very last moment, the Soviet vessel slowed. It stopped. The world took its first breath in a week. The secret deal. Publicly, it seemed like the Soviet Union backed down. In reality, high-level negotiation was happening behind the scenes. Robert Kennedy met secretly with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. The U.S. offered to remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey, but keep it secret, guarantee no invasion of Cuba. In exchange, the USSR would remove its nuclear missiles from Cuba. On October 28, 1962, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev agreed. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest humanity has come to nuclear war, was over. But inside the Pentagon, some military leaders believed Kennedy's decision was weak. They still thought Cuba should have been invaded. Years later, declassified records show that General Lemnitzer and others believed the U.S. missed an opportunity. Kennedy, however, believed he had prevented global catastrophe. But avoiding war did not mean the CIA stopped worrying about Castro. Because after diplomacy failed to remove him, a darker strategy began. Though military invasion was avoided in 1962, the U.S. government had not given up on removing Fidel Castro. Instead of open warfare, the battle moved into the shadows. Shortly after the Bay of Pigs failure in April 1961, the CIA initiated a covert program named Project Mongoose, directed by Air Force General Edward Lansdale under the supervision of Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. The mission was simple: remove Castro as soon as possible. But the methods were anything but simple. What followed were some of the most audacious operations in CIA history. Assassination attempts, as confirmed by U.S. Senate. During the 1975 Church Committee hearings, the Senate publicly acknowledged that the CIA had planned or supported at least 8 assassination attempts against Castro. Among the verified attempts, poisoned cigars, delivered through intermediaries to Castro's associates. Exploding seashells, designed for placement on a beach where Castro was known to swim. Poison diving suit, lined with tuberculosis bacteria and fungus spores. Mafia collaboration documented. The CIA contacted American mobsters Sam Giancana and Johnny Rosselli, offering them $150,000 to eliminate Castro. Payments were negotiated in Las Vegas casinos. Each plot had 3 things in common: high creativity, high secrecy, and repeated failure. Why target Castro so aggressively? Castro was viewed as the first domino. If Cuba remained communist and Soviet-aligned, Latin America might follow. His televised speeches mocked America. Every failed operation embarrassed the CIA further. President Kennedy's rejection of Operation Northwoods limited direct military action, but his approval of Project Mongoose signaled willingness for more discreet pressure. The CIA used psychological warfare, sabotage of Cuban industries, deployment of agents on the island, funding of resistance movements. But Castro's intelligence service, DGI, Departamento de Seguridad del Estado, rapidly infiltrated CIA networks. Many operatives were arrested or turned into double agents. The operation that never happened. According to declassified records, one CIA proposal in 1962 suggested staging violence in Guantanamo Bay, similar to Northwood-style tactics but on a smaller scale. It wasn't approved, but it showed the idea of manufacturing conflict persisted beyond Northwoods. By 1965, Project Mongoose was considered a failure. Castro remained in power. Cuba remained communist, and the CIA remained frustrated. But what no one realized was that Kennedy's assassination in November 1963 would completely shift the trajectory. With Lyndon B. Johnson in the White House, efforts against Castro became less aggressive. Yet the fear that sparked Operation Northwoods would transfer to new targets: Vietnam, the Soviet Union, and eventually global counterterrorism. The Cold War was far from over, and the U.S. was about to enter a new era of covert conflict. Although Operation Northwoods was rejected and its assassination plots failed to remove Castro, its underlying concept, manipulating perception to justify action, did not disappear. It transformed. The rejection of Northwoods did not signal an end to psychological warfare. It only pushed planning deeper into covert channels, redirecting focus from Cuba to Vietnam and global counterinsurgency initiatives. 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin Incident. On August 2nd and 4th, 1964, the U.S. government reported that North Vietnamese patrol boats attacked the USS Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin. The second attack, according to later declassified NSA documents, never actually happened. But it was enough. President Lyndon B. Johnson used the alleged attack to obtain congressional approval for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, effectively granting authority to deploy U.S. combat forces. Within a year, over 184,000 American troops were in Vietnam. Years later, declassified records confirmed that officials had withheld critical intelligence and exaggerated the threat to secure support for escalation. Some historians argue this event reflected a similar tactical mindset seen in Northwoods, manufacturing or amplifying an incident to justify intervention. CIA covert influence expands. During the Vietnam War, the CIA executed Operation Phoenix, aimed at dismantling Viet Cong networks. Although officially designed to target insurgents, the program resulted in widespread human rights concerns and thousands of extrajudicial killings, according to CIA and Senate reports. Simultaneously, Operation Chaos, 1967 to 1974, a CIA domestic surveillance program, prohibited under the agency's charter, targeted anti-war activists inside the United States. It reportedly tracked over 7,000 individuals and 1,000 organizations, blurring lines between national security and civil rights. Once again, the illusion of control justified aggressive action. 1975 Church Committee Revelations. The turning point came when the U.S. Senate held hearings in 1975, known as the Church Committee. For the first time, the public learned about many covert CIA actions, including assassination plots, Castro and others, domestic intelligence operations, surveillance of journalists and political figures, collaboration with foreign regimes for targeted disappearances. It was also during these hearings that Operation Northwoods was publicly referenced, although the documents themselves were still classified at that time. The committee concluded, intelligence excesses were not isolated. They were the result of institutional pressures, inadequate oversight, and misconceptions of necessity. Oversight structures were reformed, but the intelligence mindset created in the Cold War persisted. Shift to the Soviet front and global conflicts. Through the 1980s, under President Ronald Reagan, the CIA began backing anti-communist forces globally, from Afghanistan, supporting the Mujahideen, to Central America, funding the Contras. Covert actions intensified, often relying on plausible deniability, selective reporting, and psychological operations. Again, Northwoods was never revived, but the principle of shaping public perception to justify intervention remained ingrained in certain strategic circles. Why Northwoods still matters. Though never executed, Operation Northwoods serves today as a documented historical warning. It proves that even within democratic governments, moments of extreme fear and strategic urgency can produce proposals with dangerous consequences. Its rejection by Kennedy may have prevented a fabricated war in 1962. Yet it could not prevent real wars, real covert operations, and real manipulation techniques from emerging in decades that followed. As history unfolded, one truth became clear. Stopping one operation doesn't dismantle an idea. The concept is archived, but never forgotten. For 35 years, Operation Northwoods remained buried deep in Pentagon archives. Only men in high command in 1962 were aware of the proposal. Not Congress, not the media, not the public. That changed in 1997, when the U.S. government declassified over 8 million pages of Cold War intelligence and military documentation under the JFK Document Release Initiative. Among them, a 15-page memorandum outlining Operation Northwoods, signed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and delivered to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. For the first time, the public could read, word for word, proposals detailing fabricated terror attacks on American citizens, staged incidents to provoke war, and a carefully structured campaign of false blame. The response was immediate. Major outlets like ABC News, journalist James Bamford in his book Body of Secrets, and several Cold War historians verified its authenticity. ABC described it as plans for the U.S. to commit acts of terrorism against its own citizens and blame Cuba, approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Officially, the document listed precise actions: simulated or staged aircraft hijackings, bomb explosions in U.S. cities, the sinking of a U.S. Navy ship near Cuba, a real or simulated hostile attack on a U.S. vessel. Casualty lists would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. Verbatim phrase from the document. Every word was real. Every proposal originated from the nation's top military leaders. But the most critical fact remains this. Operation Northwoods was never implemented. It was rejected by President John F. Kennedy, who reportedly left the meeting disturbed. Shortly after, he removed General Lemnitzer as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Though Kennedy approved other covert actions, historians widely agree. His refusal to authorize Northwoods marked a defining moment in presidential ethical decision-making during the Cold War. Historical significance. Operation Northwoods stands today as one of the most extreme false flag proposals ever officially documented inside the U.S. government. A rare example of a president overruling his own military leadership at the height of strategic fear. A case study in intelligence ethics and civilian oversight. Since its disclosure, Northwoods has been taught in political science programs, security studies, and military ethics courses worldwide. It is often cited as evidence of why oversight, transparency, and public accountability are vital in national security strategies. The final lesson. Northwoods does not prove that such actions occurred, only that they were considered. It is a reminder that even in democratic nations, fear can push strategic minds toward dangerous ideas, especially when the enemy feels close and the stakes feel existential. But it also proves something else. Stopping a plan doesn't erase the logic that created it. It can remain dormant, waiting for a new context, a new threat, a new justification. That is why historians and intelligence analysts continue to revisit Operation Northwoods. Not because it happened, but because it almost did. In 1962, one decision prevented a manufactured war. But as history shows, the battle between truth and strategic deception never truly ended. The Cold War is over. But the lesson of Northwoods still stands, because somewhere, in times of fear and conflict, the temptation to shape reality, instead of reacting to it, always returns.